The book I'm working on now, I was telling my friend Peggy Rao before, I indulge myself when I do the first version and I let it go, and I'm up to about 350 pages now, and I really don't want this book to be that long, so I'm already trying to think of cutting, and at the same time I think of more things that should go into it, needless to say. So that's the stage that it's in now. I ride my bike along the Sammamish bike trail and probably 5 times a week. And they've now taken down some of these signs that we are restoring salmon habitat and so on. And this winter I was a King County volunteer salmon watcher at the mouth of Gold Creek, and I asked for that particular position because as I rode my bike, I saw these great big signs saying that Gold Creek was restored, etc. And so I thought, okay, I'll see how many salmon are here. Now they did. They built the King County built this beautiful bridge. I don't know how many of you go along the trail down there, but Gold Creek is a little bit south of Woodinville, where it goes into the Sammamish, and it flows through the Gold Creek golf course. So I faithfully watched for salmon and did not see a one. It doesn't mean there weren't any, but it probably means there weren't any. And I don't know how many signs they had up. I mean, most of them are down now, but if you rode your bike 5 times a week there, year in, year out, as I have done, you saw all these signs that said restoring, restoring, restoring. And so the name of my book is Unrestorable Habitat, with the subtitle, Microsoft is my neighbor now. In my introduction, I explained that I have taken my chapter titles from the incantations of the Native American first salmon ceremonies. And the title for my first chapter, and of course I've read about many, many first salmon ceremonies, all the way from Northern California. Of course, the people celebrated the return of the salmon all the way around the northern Pacific Rim, from Northern California all the way to Japan. The Ainu of Japan had first salmon ceremonies that were really quite similar to the scores on the hundreds of ceremonies on scores of rivers for century after century. And so I'll read the first page of this first chapter, and then I'll skip to those later pages. The first chapter is, the first title is, Rich People and Poor People Will Be Happy. Starkly, I'm writing on one of the themes of what pulls the whole book together, which is memoir and current affairs, is the salmon cycle, which may not return really, and my cycling on the trail. A starkly thin young man clatters toward me on a homemade skateboard, a plank fitted with the wheels from an old-fashioned roller skate. You never see old-fashioned roller skates anymore. They're all in line now. He might be boneless as well as fleshless, The southwest wind nipping behind me does not appear to flap his suit pants around any legs at all. He hasn't shaved his black bristles in weeks, while the thousands of techies in their cubicles dream up ever more sophisticated software to organize our world. This skateboarder's haphazard beard limbs the real chaos. His abyssal stare mirrors the real void, utterly unconnected with 0 ones in cyberspace. I wonder if he once fit the pants, and if he did, what happened to the rest of the suit? Perhaps he was himself a techie before our Wild West's latest boom and bust, Microsoft and Boeing outsourcing jobs all around the Pacific Rim. Though he never would have worn a suit to a high-tech job, he might have kept one for funerals and job interviews. His jacket, tweed, gray or blue or brown, is that sport jacket we have all donated to the American Veterans Truck. That one jacket you or your husband wore during all those graduate school years teaching Psych 101 or freshman comp. Now the pockets are nearly ripped off, elbows raveled halfway to the cuffs. On this chilly October afternoon, the lapels unfolded across his chest, and the strip of felt stiffener around the back of his turned-up collar shout, louder than shouts, homeless. High shimmering September gold brass backlights his grungy red day pack, a sock hanging from a broken zipper, as he trundles toward the global headquarters of the richest man on earth. I have passed the city of Redmond sign promising me that the river returns, and now I've arrived at the Mammoth Sammamish sign, Habitat Restoration Projects. And then the sign goes on to tell us about the projects that the Army Corps of Engineers, which had as its project in 1964, taking out 16 miles of meanders, turning the river into a ditch, lowering it by 7 feet. Now I live in zip code 98052, the zip of Microsoft's main campus. Computers in telemarketing and mailing centers around the nation compute that folks living in this zip must be rich. So from 6 to 10 o'clock every evening, their machines dial my answering machine, and folks like Neiman Marcus mail me catalogs, sometimes 2 from Texas in 1 week, of wares I couldn't dream of buying, gifts for the man who has everything, pictured on bright pages of pulped forests. So, as singularity looms like Hanford, I feel called to remember the Sammamish Valley before it became high-tech land, back when just about anything anybody did was automatically interactive, from weeding strawberries to feeding a pig. On Halloween night, 1937, we moved into the house on the 20 acres, 5 of the western hills of the valley, that my folks had bought in July from the state of Washington for $1,800. In those Depression years, crippled Ted Couture had not been able to pay the property taxes on the land that his grandparents had homesteaded, We had spent the summer and fall living in an abandoned cottage and then a tent. We were migrant laborers picking berries, hops, pears, and apples, earning cash to make the first mortgage payments on the $1,800. When we came back across the mountains after the last delicious were wrapped in squares of purple tissue and crated in Wenatchee, we landed with friends of my mother's in Seattle for a couple of nights. It was Halloween night. Betty was 12, I was 10. That night, Betty was going to go to a horror house. I had never heard of a horror house. In Cleveland, North Dakota, population about 150, the little kids tagged behind the big boys who dragged buggies up to rooftops and pushed over privies. Once we were shot at by a furious privy owner with a buckshot shotgun. About all the little kids following around the big kids could do was to wax the windows of cars and stores with paraffin from our mother's canning supplies. No goody-goody ivory soap for us. When the next Halloween came around, some of our sprawls would still be looped across the glass, clotted with the dust that blew all year, even in snow blizzards. I could have gone with Betty to the Ballard Horror House, but that did not suit my father's plan. Now, 65 years later, I wonder why we didn't stay with the Dyers in Ballard one more night. Why were we? My father and mother and 7-year-old sister Patty and I, shivering in our 1933 Ford V8, why were we hauling our tarpaulin-covered trailer up the deep mud ruts of a quarter-mile-long driveway, making this final leg of our depression refugee odyssey in a hard rain, in pitch blackness? Had my father precipitated an argument even too intolerable for the infinitely patient Elmer Dyer to put up with for even one more night? Why does it only now occur to me to wonder? When you're 10, you don't ask. We were towing every last stitch of our belongings in the farm wagon my father had refitted with highway wheels and tires so we could migrate from Cleveland, North Dakota to Redmond, Washington. Rain battering the roof, wheels spinning, the car crawled up the last ruts and was pulled into the dark yard. But dark as it was, in the mud-streaked headlights, it wasn't as dark as it was supposed to be. Ted and his friend Benny Whitmore were supposed to have found another place long before we came to claim it on that All Hallows Eve, but a goblin ray flickered in the rain. Though today we would call Ted and Benny something like differently abled, I doubt that our more compassionate current euphemisms would make them any more likely to benefit from the prosperity trickling down from the richest men in the world than they were then. In 1937, the homeless in Seattle were all male drifters. Now, scores of women and children also sleep on downtown streets, summer and winter. And in this rich upper left-hand corner of the richest country in the world, homeless is an adjective about as emotionally charged as daily or nightly. When everybody is poor, apologies are a frivolous waste of energy. As though he were still the owner of the farm on which he had been born, Ted welcomed us with homesteader heartiness and squatter simplicity. He offered us bowls of the stew simmering in a seldom washed, periodically replenished pot on a wood stove. At 10, of course, I didn't understand just how horrible it was, that even the stew smell was overpowered by the smell of the swamp into which the floor was sinking. We were moving into a real horror house, but all I knew then was that my heart was breaking because I was not at that very moment with Betty, being scared silly by papier-mâché skeletons and cackling witches in the Ballard Hall of Terror. If he could have stood up straight, Ted would have been a true giant. Even with palsy-bent legs, he was taller than my 6-foot father. He was about 35, my father's age, sandy-haired and blue-eyed, very bright blue eyes, in a wind-reddened face, not quite as long as a horse's. He had Frankenstein-sized hands and arms and Jurassic shoulder blades. He laughed a lot. A high, resonant hee-hee-hee that quivered his lips around his huge teeth and set off spasms in his narrow jaws and the galloping lump of his Adam's apple. He lurched about on long, thin thighs and calves, knees braced against each other, ragged boots skidding pigeon-toed into the ground so hard that every step seemed sure to send him sprawling. Probably because I was always afraid of my father, I seem to remember with particular vividness the few men who did not scare me. My mother's father, Uncle Russell, Uncle Billy, and Ted. He was unfailingly sweet and gentle, having hobbled into the only transcendence to be found by any of us, heavy, heavy, stumbling grace. Next to my father and Ted, Benny was a runt. A pudgy little man stuck to a kitchen chair with hardly any conversation beyond his wheezing. He was about 40, shaggy with gray and black hair, gray and black bristles, which he shaved once a week or so, and bulging, red-lidded, red-veined eyes, suffocating in air he couldn't exhale. My image is of a simple allegorical figure, asthma. It occurs to me now that my mother, working around him while Patty and I were at school and Ted and my father were out doing chores in the hills cutting wood, my mother might have feared that she would be alone in the house with him when the last bronchial air sac closed and he fell out of the chair. Benny's brother Roy and Mrs. Wetmore lived a half-mile south on their Willows Road chicken farm, where Mrs. Wetmore, by the way, she had kidney trouble, and the doctor told her she had appropriate names, which I don't Tiny, sharp-tongued Irish woman sat all day in the kitchen with just room for her knees between stacks of egg cartons and pails of eggs. A candling light on the chair beside her, a wet rag in her hand, scrubbing chicken shit off the eggs. When I finally got the bike I had forever yearned for, she sniffed, "It'll ruin your legs." remark occasionally surfaced as things that confuse you as a kid will for years. Till one afternoon when I was a sophomore at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, pumping my 60-pound balloon-tired, no-geared bike up Pacific Avenue, which gets steeper with every block, it hit me that Mrs. Wetmore meant that the muscles bicycling built would ruin the looks of my leg. Some things have gotten better for girls in my lifetime. Now, defined quadriceps are beautiful. Mrs. Wetmore's own life overlapped such responses of the civilized world to females on bicycles as that described by a young English woman in 1899, which was the year my father was born. And a quote from her: "Two shameless females, as Grandpa would say, in bloomers, bicycled through the village yesterday, and some of the women were so scandalized that they threw stones at them." You can ride a bike now, huh? It's my impression that Benny Wetmore had lived with the Wetmores till there simply wasn't enough room for him and the eggs for 2,500 leghorns, and Ted had taken him in. As well as he was able, he had done the woman's work, very little cleaning and not much more cooking, jobs that became wholly my mother's, of course, the instant we wormed our way through the rubble on the back porch that night. The house was one big room. There were no partitions and no other finishing from floor planks to roof rafters. Many years before, when only the shell and roof were up, the rest of the lumber stacked in the yard had accidentally burned up one night, and the coutures had never managed to complete whatever they had dreamed. By the time we arrived, the bare boards were smoked nearly black. At night, the house was so dark that the kerosene lamp on the kitchen table could do no more than cast a twilight dome over the oranges and grapes and bananas peeling off the oilcloth. Ted's father or grandfather had used cedar stumps for the house foundation, stumps already conveniently rooted in the ground from the virgin forest that had been logged. But if a stump was needed in a spot where there wasn't one, they plunked down a 2-foot length of fir log. So much for the legendary good sense of the pioneers. The cedar stumps, almost invulnerable to the termites which flew out from under the house every fall, were still intact, while the fir supports were nearly devoured. Thus, the floorboards slanted up and down from cedar to cedar, just like those disorienting floors in horror houses. My father built a platform in one corner of the house so our beds could be level. The platform sides were wedges that rose in about 8 linear feet from 0 to 6 inches. Ted and Benny slept in another unlevel corner of the house. My mother, a brilliant math and chemistry college graduate when she was 20, cooked and scrubbed for us all. This is a depression. Now it occurs to me to wonder about so many aspects of daily life. How did everybody take a bath? The minutiae of the lives of the rich are often preserved for millennia. Among the artifacts in the hieroglyph passageways, just one pyramid in the Valley of Kings, archaeologists discovered as just one of the pharaoh's requirements for a comfortable afterlife, thousands of jars of mummified ibises. But for unmemorialized common folk, so much remains quotidian lacunae. In our North Dakota shack, we had bathed in the classic manner of pioneers without plumbing. Water heated on the stove in the round galvanized bathtub. Once a week, everybody washed in the same water, beginning with the youngest and smallest, who had the least body surface and theoretically would shed the least dirt. My father would be the last to cram himself into the tub with, by that time, a little warm-up from the tea kettle. Nobody peeked. We followed the same routine in the new house, but when or where did Ted and Benny bathe? Perhaps they didn't. No doubt such nuts and bolts basics concerned my parents a good deal more than they concerned my sister and me. We had our own problems, trying to catch up in a school where we were added burdens, unwelcome, migrants' kids. How long did Ted and Benny, not to mention Ted's dangerous livestock, stay with us before they finally found some other shelter? What is that kind of day-to-day time to a 10-year-old? I had been living in a tent for 3 months. I had gone to 3 schools in September and October, where I was called an Okie, with no idea of what that meant. Automatically assumed by each new teacher to be behind, and assigned to the C class in the back of the room. Something else I didn't understand. In Cleveland, North Dakota, there weren't enough kids in any grade for subdivisions into A, B, and C. There were 6 kids in my grade in Cleveland and 3 grades in each of the 2 elementary classrooms. In our prairie hut, the tub of snow a few feet from the stove never melted in winter, while in summer the windstorms of the longest drought in the last half-millennium sifted black dust through every crack, covered the floor, and coated everything in the hut. Now, I was living in a house with floors that slanted toward 7 or 8 points of the compass, pails under the roof leaks, and air laden with mold. Ted and Benny were just one more set of discards in my refugee world. Whatever they finally found must have been woefully worse than the shelter from which we dispossessed them. I see now that pressuring them to leave must have been anguishing for my parents. We understood about squatters, but we ourselves were only a step away from their situation. A paycheck away, as people say today, except that then nobody was getting any paycheck. I know my mother liked Ted very much. No doubt his spasmodic laugh got on her nerves, but her heart must have ached for both homeless, I was going to say wretches, but though he was desperately poor, Ted was not wretched, just more vulnerable to gravity than most of the rest of us. From our first floating in the womb, we dream of transcending gravity. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth, crowed a First World War poet pilot. Our little valley's globally famous hero, son of a wealthy Seattle lawyer, boldly dropped out of Harvard to pursue his vision of transcendence. Being rich has always offered illusions of conquering gravity. You can own a few private jets, or sail multi-million-dollar balloons around the world, or donate $20 million to the Russian space program in return for a few weightless days, cooped up in a little capsule with 6 or 7 other unbathed men, eating freeze-dried steak granules, drinking your sanitized urine, and viewing your blue planet shining in lightless stage, dependably spinning in its sun orbit thanks to gravity. Or, and Bill Gates even has a trampoline room, which must be the lowest tech installation in a 21st century crystal palace of high-tech wonders. Contesting his property taxes a few years ago, Gates claimed that the King County assessor should lower his evaluation because most potential buyers would not want a trampoline room. To be a hero in our valley and its environs these days, all you need is $1 billion. Unlike Ted, you don't even have to run a business that makes a profit. Jeff Bezos made it to Times Person of the Year cover when his Seattle warehouse Amazon.com had lost only a few $100 million, down from only a few $100 more million the year before, and only a few $100 more million the year before that. After Ted and Benny finally moved out, they often came grinding up the driveway ruts for a social call. Benny and the old truck wheezing together. Only now, on this late revisiting, have I really thought about how painful Ted must have found those visits. If he was rattling along the gravel road in March, he would have looked up the hill across our neighbor's pasture, flooded with daffodils, suddenly blooming with all the light that by mid-March in western Washington seems to have been permanently washed from the sky. As a teenager, Ted might even have worked for the commercial florist, planting the rows of bulbs. By the time we arrived, the florist had long since abandoned them. People could not buy bread, let alone flowers. From perfect rows like those in the postcard pictures of the daffodil and tulip miles in our Puyallup and Skagit valleys, the bulbs had multiplied in lavish random constellations. A crowd, a host of golden daffodils, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, in the Wordsworth effusion. I have no way of knowing whether, at least before he lost the farm, Ted too might have felt my heart with rapture fills and dances with the daffodils. What a Wordsworth's more memorable and more cheerful lines. But though I have my reservations about that line now, when I was a junior in Miss Laura Bell Minter's English class, I thought it was great. On our side of the fence, the bigs, royal ants, tartarians, green gage plums, Italian prunes, king crab apples, summer transparents, romes, wine sacks, gravensteins, and bartlett pears, planted by Ted's ancestors, would be sailing our own sweet-smelling Milky Way around our own Jupiter, the enormous catalpa tree in the center of the yard. It would be sprouting its tropical 10-inch heart-shaped leaves and budding its sumptuous clusters of white orchid-like flowers, which produce slender Indian bean seed pods a foot long, marveled at by our fellow North Dakota refugees accustomed to much less showy flora. About 15 feet up the craggy gray trunk, the tree's lowest limb, a foot thick, grew straight out over the kitchen garden. My father tied a rope to it, which we would shinny up to the treehouse, which was another rope he strung back and forth a few times between a couple of higher branches to make a web in the sky. After a long, sweaty day, pulling onions, beets, carrots, peas, tomatoes, and potatoes, you could hide in the gigantic jack of the beanstalk leaves, slip the surly bonds of earth, and recline in the air. Ted was a heroic entrepreneur in one of our oldest transcendence businesses. Certainly one of the riskiest, even for a man with 2 good legs, let alone a man with cerebral palsy. My father always hired Theodore Couture's bull and boar service when Daisy needed servicing. This was something I didn't add up for years. My mother or father would have written Daisy on several numbers on the calendar, but contrary to the city notion in those days that farm kids all had precocious understanding of the fact of life, I didn't connect those notations with Sunday morning visits from Ted's golden Guernsey bull thumping across the planet like a tectonic plate on hoops. I see now that my mother had ordered my father to get the job done while she and my sister were at Sunday school and church. So occasionally, we would come home to see Ted's truck incredibly more or less still in one piece year after year, its tailgate ramp slanting from the bed to the ground, and small figures framed in a pastoral canvas of catalpa cherry trees and the honeysuckle vine that smothered half the house. My father and Ted and the bull processing from the barnyard. In one thick-knuckled fist, Ted would be gripping his prod, and in the other the short rope tied to the ring in the bull's nose. A prod had never seemed like much of a deterrent to me. After all, for centuries, heroes made spear-resistant shields from the hides of bulls. Hector, armored in his great horsehair-crested bronze helmet and bronze chest plate, carried a bronze-tipped spear and a shield with a black skin edge. But there was Ted, yanking the nostrils on 2,000 pounds of bull, staggering beneath the catalpa he never could have climbed when he was a boy, his every step a 7-league stride wrenched from Earth's iron hold. I was terrified of bulls. Back in North Dakota, my mother had reminded me every morning to watch out for Ed Weesey's bull, which roamed the pasture I had to pass on the 2-mile walk to school. Old man Weesey had lost an arm when the bull corralled him one day. Parents made sure every farm kid knew all the stories of people maimed or killed by their bulls. In those low-tech natural insemination days, bulls did not live out their lives locked in stalls, milked for their semen. 15,000 years ago, in the Lascaux Hall of the Bulls, men painted 16-foot-long bulls by the light of the bull's own fat, burning juniper wicks in stone lamps. Of all the animals portrayed in the scores of caves, bulls were almost the only ones endowed with phalluses. Considering the impressive possibilities of the many horses the artist usually left smooth-bellied and smooth-groined, one might speculate that the male aurochs somehow symbolized maleness in a way that even the stallions did not. We inherit a truly ancient mystique of bull god procreators, from the Pyrenees Cro-Magnon charcoal and ochre paintings to the golden idols of Ur, Babylon, Syria, to Greek youths and maidens jumping over charging bulls, to the Hebrew gods' cattle upon 1,000 hills, to Egypt's thousands of mummies, to the Minotaur waiting like old man Weesey's bull. You're telling me to quit? Okay. Happy day.
The one that's we're across the street over here. Yeah? But I didn't go in to take a picture of the